Okay, so just a couple of things that I noticed people doing as you're working. I noticed that several of you did show up this time with a quote already picked out to write about, and that is really good practice, right? That is absolutely a thing that you ought to be doing. Right, remember that anytime we're doing a reading from the anthology, I may ask you to do this. Right, you won't have to do it every time, but they're not going to be announced. Right, so it's better safe than sorry. Right, good to have something to write about rather than to have to fish through something, or fish through the whole story in the first couple minutes. And you know, like most of the readings from the anthology, at least up until we get to Antigone towards the end of the semester, are pretty short. Right. This is about 4.5 pages. Sonny's Blues was maybe like 12, 13 pages. That's right about as long as it's going to get until we start reading plays later on. So most of these are pretty brief and, you know, shouldn't really take you too long to get through. Now, before we get started talking about the Cask of Amontillado, I do want to sort of gauge your level of knowledge of Edgar Allan Poe, because I feel like this is a writer some of you are at least slightly familiar with, usually before you read this story. Right? How many of you have read Poe before? Okay, how many of you have read this story before? How many have read some other Poe story, in addition to this one or instead of this one? Okay, what other Poe stories do you know? What other Poe stories are you familiar with?
Something like Black Raven or something?
Okay, there's the Raven, there's the poem, right? You know, knocking, gently knocking, tapping him. The Telltale Heart, okay, yeah.
House of Usher.
You have the Telltale Heart, Follow the House of Usher, the Raven. Good. Any others you know? Did someone just shout no?
Said the Bell.
Oh, the Bells, okay. Any others you know? Okay. Yeah, go ahead, DeMarcus.
Was a mighty Poe made by him?
People often think it's Poe, but it's not. It's what the hell is that guy's name? I think it's it starts at, it's slipping my mind at the moment, but yeah, it's not Poe. I think it's M.R. James. M.R. James is the Monkey's Paw guy. Okay, so these Poe stories that you're familiar with, what do they have in common?
Dark.
Okay, that they are dark. Now, what do we mean when we say that something like this is dark?
No happiness.
Pardon?
Like death.
Okay. Yeah, they often revolve around a death, even if no one actually dies in the story or in the poem, right? In The Raven, the guy is obsessing over the death of his lost love, right? When this tame raven that someone is trained to say this one word just comes banging on the door and bothering him. Anything else that these stories have in common to you?
A few of them, like the Fall of the House of Usher and Cask of Amontillado, are set in like run-down, deserted places.
Okay.
Actually, I think like the Raven is too. Not really run-down, but deserted.
Run-down, yeah, kind of semi-deserted settings. Okay. Good. Anything else?
Usually involves some kind of malady of the mind.
Okay. These are often, you know, tales of madness or delusion. If you had to associate Poe with a particular genre, where would you put him?
Horror?
Yeah, Gothic, horror, right?
Dude just lured his best friend down to the cellars and wall them up.
Pardon?
Dude just lured his best friend down to the cellars and walled them up.
Yeah, Poe actually writes a lot of stories in which people wall other people up in cellars. This is a fairly consistent theme with him. It happens in The Fall of the House of Usher. It happens in The Black Cat. It happens in The Cask of Amontillado. He also has a kind of fixation on beautiful dead young women, but that doesn't come into this particular story. Do all of you know what we mean when we say a story is Gothic? what Gothic refers to.
It's style.
Yeah, it's a style, it's a genre. And we're not talking about very pale people with dyed black hair who wear a lot of velour and listen to very sad music. Yeah, go ahead, Frank.
It kind of falls into the same classification as Frankenstein and Dracula.
Sure.
Those are different classifications of Gothic.
Yeah, the Gothic is a genre that is specific to the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So it kind of runs around the same circuits as what would come to be called Romanticism does. Now, the Gothic usually takes place in these kinds of ruined, old-fashioned settings, castles, abandoned monasteries, things of that nature. And they're typically set in Catholic countries in Europe. So like France, Spain, or Italy. But they're usually written by Protestant writers or writers from Protestant backgrounds from England or the United States. And what these gloomy rundown settings in these foreign countries are supposed to evoke is a kind of air of gloom, dread, or oppression. Some of these stories feature real ghosts. Many do not. There's a sort of substratum of the Gothic that I like to call Scooby-Doo Gothic, in which everything, all the supernatural happenings turn out to have some sort of logical explanation, right? It's really just Old Man Withers wearing a werewolf mask trying to scare you away from his treasure. But yeah, they almost always involve supernatural events of some kind. So this is the base, this is the genre in which Poe typically writes. Anything else you know about Poe or that you know about his work?
Sad.
Pardon?
I guess like a sad reaction from people, like when they read it.
Yeah, Poe is actually trying in most of his work to evoke an emotion that he calls melancholy. And melancholy, it's a kind of sadness, but it's not just sadness, right? Melancholy is a peculiar kind of artistic sadness, a kind of beautiful sadness. You know, it's possible you've never had this particular kind of experience, right? But have any of you ever felt a kind of sadness that was kind of pleasant to wallow in? It's like you felt sad, you felt mopey, but you kind of enjoyed it. There was something pleasurable about it.
What? Explain that.
Okay, so melancholy is a kind of sadness that actually, like, you're sad and you're moping and you're depressed, but it kind of feels, it still weirdly kind of feels good, right? You take a kind of pleasure in that sadness and just kind of lay back and wallow in it. That's the difference between melancholy and simply being sad. Yeah, I mean, it sounds illogical, right?
Is it like when someone's really sick and they pass away and they're not suffering anymore, but you're sad that they passed away?
Not necessarily. I know some people often feel guilty when a loved one passes away if they had to take care of them for a long time, because there's often a kind of relief that accompanies that. But that's not really quite the same feeling. Melancholy often isn't a response to any specific situation, right? It's not a response to a specific outside stimulus. It's just, you're sort of cultivating a kind of inner sadness, usually for artistic purposes. And there's something you find pleasurable in it. Now, I would argue that that is what Poe is doing in a lot of these stories, and in a lot of his poems in particular. And you find, particularly in his poetry, he uses a lot of long vowels and sort of rhyme schemes that slow words down. Right? The idea is to get a kind of slow incantation kind of feeling that's supposed to induce melancholy. Is that what he's doing in this story? Is this story about cultivating sadness? No. Probably not so much, right? There's a little bit too much action here, really sort of for the cultivation of sadness. Anything else you guys know about Poe?
He had a hard life.
Do you know anything specific about how his life was supposed to have been hard?
Did he leave home like really early?
Yeah, he was orphaned very young.
Yeah.
Adopted by a wealthy guy in Richmond. Yeah, Frank?
Tuberculosis, the Red Death, that's the one I forgot.
Okay, yeah, Mask of the Red Death is maybe about tuberculosis. His parents died of tuberculosis, his wife died of tuberculosis. I mean, in the 19th century, lots of people died of tuberculosis. It was all over the place. But a lot of what we think we know about Poe is at least slightly inaccurate.
His biographer was
Yeah, when Poe died, he had made his living primarily as an editor of magazines and as a critic writing reviews. And he made a lot of enemies. He pissed a lot of people off. And there was one guy in particular whom he thought he'd made his peace with, a guy by the name of Rufus Griswold. And when Poe died unexpectedly on Election Day in Baltimore, after being hustled into the voting booth several times to cast several different votes by unscrupulous people who just saw this delirious guy wandering on the streets, like, hey, let's get him to vote. Also, side note, if you ever go to Baltimore, like everything in Baltimore is Poe this, Poe that. There are bars and restaurants called the Raven. The football team is called the Raven. There are all these Poe monuments all over the place. The only thing he ever did in Baltimore was die. So keep that in mind.
Baltimore. He casted a list of votes.
And he casted a bunch of votes, yeah. So when he died, he left his reputation in the hands of this guy, Rufus Griswold. He and Griswold had a falling out. Poe thought they'd made it up. Griswold did not. So Griswold published the first biography of Poe, which painted him as a kind of monstrous alcoholic. Most people who knew Poe said that this image was actually inaccurate, that this is not true. So a lot of the image we have of Poe comes from this kind of hit job biography. So one thing that this should warn us against is reading too much of what we think we know about an author's biography into his work. Because it's, one, what we know may very well be inaccurate, and two, even a first-person narrative is usually not a form of autobiography, right? We all recognize that the narrator in a short story or novel typically is an invented character, right? Is not the author, is probably not a stand-in for the author. So that's kind of the angle I want to look at this from specifically, right? I want to look at this from the angle of narration. Now, any work of fiction has what we sometimes call an implied author. The implied author doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the actual author or with any person living or dead. What the implied author really is a set of values that the text seems to endorse. So, for example, when we looked at Cathedral, the implied author in that particular text seems to does the text itself seem to be more sympathetic to the narrator or to Robert the blind man? If we look at Cathedral.
You said more sympathetic?
Yeah, who's treated more sympathetically in Cathedral?
Robert was
Robert's the blind man, right?
Oh.
Which character does the text seem to like better?
Oh, right.
the blind man.
Yeah, Robert is more like sort of the good guy, right? So the values that are associated with Robert there, right? Open-mindedness, openness to new experience, sort of value of community and contact, right? That's where we would locate the implied author there. If we look at a story like Sonny's Blues, right, the implied author there probably has something to do with, with family values and with open communication, right? The problem between the two brothers is that they don't hear each other. What set of values do you think is endorsed in this particular text? What's the most important thing that happens in this story? What's the story about?
The revenge.
Yes, it's about revenge, right?
Yep.
And do you think that the story endorses or is critical of the idea of revenge?
Endorsed.
Okay, why would you think it endorses the idea of revenge?
Because went through the whole plan, kind of deal with my problems and everything.
Yeah, pardon?
He locked a guy in a catacombs. I mean, that's pretty vengeful.
Yeah. I mean, we see, at least on the physical level, the revenge plot is successful here. Yeah, Frank?
The one who's narrating it is Montresor himself. Seems.
Okay. Yeah, and one thing I will say too is the implied author and the narrator don't necessarily have to match up. Right? We already saw that with Cathedral, right? That the story is actually more sympathetic to this guy the narrator is suspicious of. There are basically two kinds of narrator when we talk in these terms. A reliable narrator shares the values of the implied author. Right? A reliable narrator is basically just a mouthpiece for these values for the implied author. We tend to find reliable narrators most often in sort of what we'd think of as 19th century realist fiction, Charles Dickens, stuff like that. An unreliable narrator we find more often in modern contemporary literature, and often also in the Gothic. The unreliable narrator is a narrator whose values differ from those of the implied author. So the narrator in Cathedral, for example, would be an unreliable narrator because his values don't match up to the values the text seems to endorse. So we'll figure out which one of these we think Montresor is as we go through this, but remember that he doesn't necessarily, just because the narrator endorses a particular set of values doesn't mean that the story does. So let's go back to the sort of idea of revenge and whether or not the story endorses it. Let's look first at how revenge is defined here. What is required for a revenge plot to be successful? Yeah, Darius.
Do something to you.
Okay, if somebody does, okay, yeah, on the one hand, somebody has to do something to you. You're getting back at someone. Well, how does the story frame this? How does Montresor himself define successful revenge? What does it require?
Not showing any sign of, he didn't act like he was mad. He acted the same way with him.
Okay, yeah, on the one, you have to be sneaky about it, right? You have to plot in the dark, not out in the open. What else? What else is required for successful revenge?
Fakes himself with behaviors and all those things with his friends.
Pardon?
He fakes himself with his friends.
Yeah. I mean, that's basically, yeah, he doesn't, yeah, he plays a part, he pretends that he doesn't have any ill intent towards Fortunato. Yeah, Frank?
You get away with it.
Yeah, that's big, important element, right? You get away with it. It's not revenge if you get caught. So you have to get away with it. Right? It has to be a surprise.
No witnesses. That's why he sent his maids home.
Yeah, no witnesses, because they can compromise you, however loyal you might think they be. What else? Like, is it enough to just surprise Fortunato and get away with it?
He has to make him suffer.
He has to make him suffer, and, more importantly, Fortunato has to know it was him, right?
Yeah.
He has to make himself known to Fortunato as the Avenger. It's like, ha-ha, it was me all along, and now you suffer. Right? It's not enough to just get back at Fortunato. Fortunato has to know where the knife is coming from. Or if you look at the first paragraph here, the 1,000 injuries of Fortunato I had borne as best I could, but when he ventured upon insult I vowed revenge. You, who so well know the nature of my soul, will not suppose, however, that I gave utterance to a threat. At length I would be avenged. This was a point definitively settled, but the very definitiveness with which it was resolved precluded the idea of risk. I must not only punish, but punish with impunity. A wrong is unredressed when retribution overtakes its redresser. It is equally unredressed when the avenger fails to make himself felt as such to him who has done the wrong. So this is where he gives us his little definition of successful revenge, right? You have to be patient. Wait your turn. Keep smiling your viper's smile in your friend's face. You can't get caught. And he has to know it was you. Now, is there anything else that strikes you about this paragraph? Is there anything here that... Now, he's explaining to us revenge, almost as an art form, right? What is he not explaining to us?
Why?
He did.
The reason why.
Yeah.
He just said he was insulted.
Yeah. He says that he had borne the 1,000 injuries of Fortunato, that Fortunato is now ventured on insult, and this cannot stand. But what are we never told?
What he did.
Yeah, what's the insult? Why does Montresor never tell us what Fortunato's insult was? Pardon?
It's just not important for the story.
Maybe, but I think there's a suggestion here of a more specific reason. Yeah, Frank, go ahead.
He hints at it, but as to why he never really tells you.
Yeah, and we'll get at the ways he hints at what might have happened.
Is it like, cause like he doesn't want us to know like if the revenge was like needed or like not needed to the extent that he took it to?
Well, here's the question I'll ask you. Is Montresor talking to us?
No.
He's probably talking to someone who already knows the insult.
Exactly. When he says, you
Yeah.
who so well know the nature of my soul, right? This implies another listener.
Yeah.
right? So we have here also what's called an implied auditor. Right, this is another invented character who never speaks, but who listens to all of Montresor's story. And Montresor is making certain assumptions about this auditor, right? We've already got to one here, right? That the auditor already knows what Fortunato did, and so does not need to be told. What else does Montresor seem to be assuming throughout the story about this auditor?
That he won't say anything.
Yeah, that this is someone who's not going to talk, right? Who is going to keep his secret, and who is broadly sympathetic in some way to Montresor's views, right? So yeah, he's not going to blab. And he's someone who Montresor regards as sympathetic or understanding. All right, so when we get here to Montresor's portrayal of Fortunato, right? Does the Fortunato we actually get match up very well to the Fortunato Montresor describes? How does Montresor describe Fortunato?
As this horrible guy who injures and insults everyone around him.
Does he insult everyone?
No, well, yeah.
He's insulted Montresor, right? This is a guy who's insulted Montresor. Does he paint Fortunato as an overall horrible person when he's describing him? Yeah, Darius.
Cause like he was like, you're rich, respected, admired, beloved.
Yeah. Fortunato is right. We know Fortunato is wealthy. Montresor, at the very least, says he's respected and even feared. Admired, yeah. And what is Fortunato's weak point, according to Montresor?
Fine wine.
Yeah, he's a connoisseur of wines, right? It's not just that this is a guy who loves wine, right? When we think of like a connoisseur, what does that mean to be a connoisseur of something? An expert, right? Yeah. Somebody who really knows his stuff, really knows what he's talking about, right? Has excellent and cultivated taste. So, someone who's a connoisseur of wine, how would we expect that person to sample a fine wine? What would that person do with it?
You would smell it.
Yep. You pour it into the glass, you warm it with your hand a little bit, you smell it, you swirl it around to look at the color, right? You sip it, you swish it around in your mouth a little bit, right? And then if you're just tasting, you often spit it out. Right, so a connoisseur is looking for all kinds of subtle details in a particular glass of wine. When Fortunato is confronted with wine in this story, how does he react? Excited, right? Yeah. Does he consume it like a connoisseur would? No. He chugs it, right? Like any old cheap-ass supermarket jug. So this guy is not, whatever his own opinion of his abilities as a wine critic, whatever Montresor says about Fortunato's genuine connoisseurship of wines, he doesn't act like a connoisseur. Right? He acts like, essentially like, drunken frat kid, right? Just guzzling wine where he gets it. In fact, he's drunk when Montresor meets him, right? And I think that the costume that he's wearing when Montresor encounters him is telling as well. Right, if we look, it's about fourth paragraph. It was about dusk, one evening during the supreme madness of the carnival season, that I encountered my friend. He accosted me with excessive warmth, for he had been drinking much. The man wore motley. He had on a tight-fitting party-striped dress, and his head was surmounted by the conical cap and bells. I was so pleased to see him that I should never have done wringing his hand. So, the multicolored outfit, the cap and bells on his head, what does he dress like?
Like a dress up.
Like a jester, like a fool, right? Now, it's also important what time of year this is. We're just going to note this and sit on it for a minute. It'll become important later. Does anybody know what carnival season is?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, what's carnival?
It's like a huge parade,
Mm-hmm.
and people dress up in costumes.
Yeah. When does it occur?
Like early February, I think. Well, in Trinidad it does. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, and yet it occurs pretty much the same time of year in Trinidad, in South America, in France, Italy, Spain, right? All the places where it's celebrated. It's similar to Mardi Gras, right? So if you know what Mardi Gras is, you have a pretty good sense of what Carnival looks like. Except I think Carnival lasts a little longer. I think it's multi-days, right? Multiple days, right? But yeah, similar kind of situation. Like if we think about what Mardi Gras represents, right? What comes right after Mardi Gras? In the Christian calendar.
Lent?
Lent, yes. And what is Lent?
Where you give up things.
Yeah, Lent is about fasting. Giving things up, depriving yourself of things. So, Carnival and Mardi Gras are supposed to be like one last big blowout of indulgence before you start the self-denial that's expected of you in the Lent season. So yeah, just remember this part. This is important. So they've met during Carnival, and Montresor is genuinely pleased to see Fortunato, right? Because this means his plot can go into action. So he's dressed as the fool. He's clearly doesn't behave in the ways we would expect someone who is respected and feared in this way to behave. What do you notice about Montresor's behavior as he guides him down into the catacombs?
He's trying to convince him not to go.
Yeah, he keeps trying to give him a chance to back out, right?
Yeah.
Keeps giving hints.
Yeah. Little hints as to what's about to happen to him.
There's just something wrong.
What's that?
There's something wrong with this situation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, can you give me an example?
Unfortunately, it gives the sign that, the Freemason.
Okay.
Montresor pulls out a trowel. And
Yeah.
Is it like when you have a trowel just on it?
Yeah, it's if you're not actually actively engaged in laying bricks, there's very little reason to be carrying a trowel around, right?
Yeah.
Right. I broke and reached him a flagon of de Grave. He emptied it at a breath. His eyes flashed with a fierce light. He laughed and threw the bottle upwards with a gesticulation I did not understand. I looked at him in surprise. He repeated the movement, a grotesque one. "You do not comprehend," he said. "Not I," I replied. "Then you are not of the Brotherhood." "How? You are not of the Masons." "Yes, yes," I said. "Yes, yes. You, impossible. A Mason?" "A Mason," I replied. "A sign," he said. "A sign." "It is this," I answered, producing from beneath the folds of my roquelaire a trowel. "You jest," he exclaimed, recoiling a few paces. "But let us proceed to the Amontillado." So what is Fortunato doing here?
Sign of the Freemasons.
Sign of the Freemasons, right? Does everybody know what the Freemasons are, more or less? Some of you are giving me this kind of incredulous look that says, no, you have no idea what a Freemason is. Okay. Anybody who does know what the Freemasons are, can you explain?
The Freemasons were a secret order that was banned by the Catholic Church, as it states there. Many of our founding fathers were Freemasons.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, it's basically a sort of secret upper middle class society that people have often argued sort of guards various kinds of esoteric knowledge, right? They're secretive, so people tend to suspect that the Masons know all sorts of things. And being a member of the Masons is a mark of distinction in some communities. So what Fortunato is doing by flashing this sign that Montresor doesn't understand, essentially what's he doing?
He's telling him he's a Freemason.
Yeah, I'm a Freemason and you're not, right? It's an example of, shall we say, mild dickishness on the part of Fortunato. He's showing off. I'm of the Brotherhood. You're not of the Brotherhood. And then when Montresor shows him the trowel, given what we know about the literal action of the story, what's he doing, showing him the trowel?
I'm just giving him a really big hint.
He's showing him the thing that's going to kill him, right? This is the tool that Montresor is going to use to wall up Fortunato in the basement. And he's using Fortunato's little boast about the Masons as an opportunity to have a sick little joke. So, I know something you don't know. Something more important than what you think I don't know, Fortunato. Now, is there a sense that Fortunato gets that something's up there? That something's weird about this?
Yeah, he struggles back a few paces.
Yeah. Montresor pulls out the trowel and Fortunato jumps back, which indicates that Fortunato has not completely taken leave of his senses and does not completely trust this guy, though he still proceeds down to the basement with him. Any other little hints that we see Montresor giving Fortunato of what's about to happen to him?
Motto.
Okay, yeah, the motto, right? I forget your arms. A huge human foot d'or, right, so a human foot in gold, in a field azure is blue. The foot crushes a serpent rampant whose fangs are embedded in the heel. So it would look something like this. And I apologize in advance for the general shittiness of my artwork. But, you know, hey, I teach English, not drawing. So, right, the foot is stomping on the snake, and the snake's biting the heel of the foot. Right, and the motto means no one punishes me with impunity, right? No one tries to get one over on me and gets away with it. And Fortunato doesn't get this little joke either, right? He says, ah, good, wonderful, yes. Let's keep going, more wine. Now, as they're first going down to the catacombs together, right, Montresor is helping Fortunato along. It says, the gait of my friend was unsteady. Or a little further up here, a paragraph up from that. I took from their sconces 2 flambeaux. Now, the fact that Montresor uses a word like flambeau instead of torch, or like roquelaire instead of cloak, indicates to us what about him?
Educated.
Educated, yeah. But even I'm educated, right? And I sure as hell wouldn't call a torch a flambeau.
Upper class.
Yeah, okay, it indicates, yeah, that plus his name indicates French, aristocracy, and probably also a little bit showy, right? Likes to show off his superior knowledge and vocabulary. Likes to show off his intelligence. So he takes from their sconces 2 flambeaux, and giving one to Fortunato, bowed him through several suites of rooms to the archway that led into the vaults. I passed down a long and winding staircase, requesting him to be cautious as he followed. We came at length to the foot of the descent, and stood together upon the damp ground of the catacombs of the Montresors. The gait of my friend was unsteady, and the bells on his cap jingled as he strode. The pipe, said he. It is farther on, said I, but observe the white webwork which gleams from these cavern walls. He turned towards me and looked into my eyes the two filmy orbs that distilled the rheum of intoxication. Nitre, he asked at length. Nitre, I replied. So, when he's showing Fortunato the walls, what is he pointing out to him?
The stuff that's clinging to the walls.
The stuff that's clinging to the walls, or this, this nitre, this substance that appears on damp cavern walls. And what does he refer to it as? What is he asking Fortunato to observe? What's the pattern it forms?
A web.
Yeah, observe the white webwork on the walls, right? This is the spider inviting the fly into its den. Right, observe the white webwork, right? I'm about to capture you, Fortunato. How long have you had that cough? My poor friend found it impossible to reply for many minutes. It is nothing, he said at last. Come, I said with decision. We will go back. Your health is precious. You are rich, respected, admired, beloved. You are happy as once I was. You are a man to be missed. For me it is no matter. We will go back. You will be ill, and I cannot be responsible. Besides, there is Lucrece. Enough, he said. The cough is a mere nothing. It will not kill me. I shall not die of a cough. True. True, I replied. Now, why does he say true here when Fortunato says, I shall not die of a cough?
Because I'm going to kill you.
Yeah, he knows Fortunato's not going to die of a cough. Right. He's having another little joke on Fortunato. More of the I know something you don't know game, right? So what we call dramatic irony. Right. This is when either the reader or a character in a particular text knows something that one of the characters doesn't. Here I knocked off the neck of a bottle which I drew from a long low of its fellows that lay upon the mold. Drink, I said, presenting him the wine. He raised it to his lips with a leer. He paused and nodded to me familiarly while his bells jingled. I drink, he said, to the buried that repose around us, and I to your long life. And again, he means it, right? He wants Fortunato to live a long time behind that wall, suffering. So much of this early part of the story is like a cat playing with a mouse, right? Montresor is luring Fortunato down to his death. He's getting his revenge. Fortunato has no idea what the fuck is going on, right? He just knows that at the end of this journey, he's supposed to get some really fine, expensive wine. Montresor is dangling his superior knowledge of what is going to happen in front of Fortunato the whole time. And then, when they reach their destination, Fortunato is locked up in an instant, right? Completely unprepared for what is happening, despite the fact that Montresor's been subtly hinting at what's coming the entire time. Throwing the lynx about his waist, it was but the work of a few seconds to secure it. He was too much astounded to resist. Withdrawing the key, I stepped back from the recess. Pass your hand, I said over the wall. You cannot help feeling the nitre. Indeed, it is very damp. Once more, let me implore you to return. No? Then I must positively leave you. But I will first render you all the little attentions in my power. The Amontillado, ejaculated my friend. Not yet recovered from his astonishment. True, I replied. The Amontillado. Now, if we go a little further down, we look at how Montresor behaves, or how he describes his behavior as he's building the wall. I think this is where we see a hint of tension coming into his account. I had scarcely laid the first tier of the masonry when I discovered that the intoxication of Fortunato had in great measure worn off. The earliest indication I had of this was a low moaning cry from the depth of the recess. It was not the cry of a drunken man. Then there was a long and obstinate silence. I laid the second tier and the third and the fourth, and then I heard the furious vibration of the chain. The noise lasted for several minutes, during which, that I might hearken to it with the more satisfaction, I ceased my labors and sat down upon the bones. When at last the clanking subsided, I resumed the trowel and finished without interruption the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh tier. The wall was now nearly upon a level with my breast. I again paused, and holding the flambeau over the mason work, threw a few feeble rays upon the figure within. When does Montresor seem to be enjoying himself the most?
When Fortunato was struggling.
Yeah, as long as Fortunato is clanking the chains and screaming, right, this is fun. As long as Fortunato is fighting back, this is fun. Right, he sits down, rests, and hearkens to the sound. Right, he's enjoying the sounds of Fortunato's distress. A succession of loud and shrill screams, bursting suddenly from the throat of the chained form, seemed to thrust me violently back. For a brief moment I hesitated. I trembled. Unsheathing my rapier, I began to grope with it about the recess, but the thought of an instant reassured me. I placed my hand upon the solid fabric of the catacombs and felt satisfied. I reapproached the wall. I replied to the yells of him who clamored. I re-echoed. I aided. I surpassed them in volume and strength. I did this, and the clamorer grew still. Right, again, right, enjoying Fortunato's moments of distress. This is great. This is wonderful. This is exactly what revenge is supposed to be like. This is how it's supposed to feel. It was now midnight, and my task was drawing to a close. I had completed the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th tier. I had finished a portion of the last and the 11th. There remained but a single stone to be fitted and plastered in. I struggled with its weight. I placed it partially in its destined position, but now there came from out the niche a low laugh that erected the hairs upon my head. It was succeeded by a sad voice, which I had difficulty in recognizing as that of the noble Fortunato. The voice said, "A very good joke, indeed, an excellent jest. We will have many a rich laugh about it at the palazzo, over our wine." "The Amontillado," I said. "Yes, the Amontillado. But is it not getting late? Will they not be awaiting us at the palazzo, the Lady Fortunato and the rest? Let us be gone." "Yes," I said, "let us be gone." "For the love of God, Montresor." "Yes," I said, "for the love of God." But to these words I hearkened in vain for a reply. I grew impatient. I called aloud, "Fortunato!" No answer. I called again, "Fortunato!" No answer still. I thrust a torch through the remaining aperture and let it fall within. There came forth in return only a jingling of the bells. My heart grew sick. It was the dampness of the catacombs that made it so. I hastened to make an end of my labor. I forced the last stone into position. I plastered it up. Against the new masonry, I re-erected the old rampart of bones. For the half of a century, no mortal has disturbed them. In pace requiescat. So at what point here does Montresor stop having fun?
And he stops applying.
Yeah, once Fortunato goes quiet and accepts what's happened to him and he's not getting out of it, suddenly this is no fun for Montresor anymore. Why do you think that is? Why do you think the fun has gone out of it for him?
Because he's not suffering. Well, he's suffering, but you know,
Yeah, but it's passive suffering, right?
so that kills the fact of revenge.
Yeah, I mean, like, what does this suggest to the fact that Fortunato is no longer even fighting, right? All he hears is the jingling of the bells on his fool's cap. What does this tell him about this guy whom he had built up as this fearsome opponent?
His weakness.
Yeah, Fortunato really wasn't anybody to be respected or feared anyway. Basically, what Montresor has done is lured a drunken dupe down into his basement, walled him up to starve to death. Right. This guy's no match for him. This guy's not a suitable revenge opponent, right? not a suitable object of revenge. And so we get here indications that Montresor even feels guilty about what he's done, right? The fact that his heart grows sick as he's pushing the last stone in. That he's avenging himself upon somebody who wasn't worth it and maybe doesn't deserve it. So, does the implied author actually value revenge as much as Montresor does? Yeah, we see here hints that revenge is ultimately unsatisfying. Even when it technically meets all of the criteria that the narrator laid out at the beginning. I mean, by his own standards, this is completely successful, right? Fortunato knows where the blow comes from. It came as a total surprise to him. And Montresor has got away with it. Fortunato's been down there for 50 years, nobody knows. But he's still sort of unsatisfied. Right? So what does this suggest to us then, to get back to the role of the listener? What does this suggest about Montresor's reasons for telling this story? Okay, it could be trying to expunge guilt, right? Work through feelings of guilt.
Advice, maybe?
Pardon?
Advice, maybe? Like saying it wasn't worth it. Maybe the person really loved him or something like that.
Does he frame this, though, in a way that would make it look like he's trying to give someone a sort of how-to guide or a moral guide? Yeah. How does he make himself look throughout the whole story, up until this very last point?
In the right.
Pardon?
In the right.
Yeah. He makes himself look like he's in the right. Right? I was right to do this. And why does he describe all of his little jokes against Fortunato?
Show how clever he is.
Yeah, he's showing off his intelligence and his wit, right? So on the one hand, he is trying to justify himself. And he's also trying to show off. Right? I am so clever. I am so smart. I pulled this off so perfectly.
But for 50 years, no one's noticed me.
Uh-huh. Got to tell somebody, right? But that little bit at the end also suggests, right, that he feels the need to justify himself in some way here, right? He doesn't have to explain why he did it, because this other person already knows. And I think that's probably hinted at by a number of things in the story. Like, where has he brought Fortunato to?
Catacombs.
Catacombs, and what's all around them?
His ancestors.
Yeah, Montresor's dead ancestors, right? The bones of Montresor's ancestors, right? Fortunato asks about Montresor's coat of arms. Right? He says, I forget your arms. And he tells the family symbol, right? So whatever insults Fortunato made to Montresor probably had something to do with family honor, right? Something to do with the family. So that's implied, that's hinted at, if not spoken. But yeah, I think what's going on here, what Montresor is trying to do, is trying to justify himself to a sympathetic listener. I don't think we have enough information to really say much about who that listener might be, except for what we've already determined, right? That someone Montresor thinks won't blab and is broadly sympathetic to his cause or his personality. Right, okay. Any questions about any of this? Okay, so for next time, right, you are going to be doing assignment 3 on page 86 and writing analytically, and you'll be choosing your own objects of comparison for that, right? Just make sure when you choose your objects of comparison, that you are choosing things that are similar enough that they have a basis for comparison, right? Things that are similar enough to compare logically. And we'll talk. We'll go over that in class. The assignment itself, it won't be due till Monday. Right? Won't be due till till Wednesday night at midnight. But we'll go over how to do it in class on Wednesday. All right.
What's this?
All right. So we'll see you in a couple of days.